mean, George Washington is a unique American. We owe our whole country to George Washington. I mean, not only did he defeat the British in the Revolutionary War as our general, but we owe our republic to Washington. There was a movement to make George Washington the king of America. And if George Washington wanted to be the king, he probably would have been the king, and we'd be a monarchy. But George Washington didn't want the crown. He turned it down. I mean, how many people would do something like that? If they want to make you the king, I mean, it's good to be the king, right? I mean, who wouldn't want to be king? Well, George Washington didn't want to be king. He put country above himself. Now, sure, he was a wealthy man in his own right. In fact, up until the election of John F. Kennedy, he was the wealthiest person, adjusted for inflation, to be president. Now the wealthiest president is Donald Trump. But before Kennedy, it was Washington. It was just because he married a wealthy widow, Martha Washington, who had a lot of money. She was very wealthy. But he was a successful businessman, and he made a lot of money himself. So he was a successful guy. But he wasn't a king, and he could have been king, and he turned it down. And there are a lot of other great things. If you go and study George Washington to realize, what a unique and amazing individual George Washington was, the founder of our nation. Now, I know people will say, well, but he owned slaves. Well, so what? A lot of people owned slaves back in 1760s, 1780s, 1790s. It was a different world. And although I think George Washington, was, pro-slavery when he was younger, by the time he died, I think his opinions had evolved. He freed the slaves that he owned himself. I think he freed his one slave when he died, and in his will, he freed the rest of his slaves when his wife died, and so they were freed on her death. But you can't just judge a man by the fact that he had slaves in a time when slavery was widely accepted everywhere in the world and had been for thousands of years. It wasn't like slavery was uniquely American. The whole world had slaves. In fact, America was at the forefront of ending slavery. It was the northern U.S. states that were the first areas of the world to outlaw slavery. Right? So we started it, even though we had some stragglers down south and we had a civil war. We led the charge on ending slavery. But some people want to use that to diminish George Washington's stature. No, he was a phenomenal American. And but for George Washington, we wouldn't be a republic. We would be a monarchy. And, I want to also take a little time to talk about the difference between a republic and a democracy, because I know Elon Musk has been making a lot of posts about democracy. And I really wish that he would correct that. Because, again, a lot of people listen to Elon Musk. He's got a great platform. Probably the biggest soapbox in the history of soapboxes. And, he's been posting a lot of good stuff. He posts Ron Paul now, Milton Friedman. I mean, a lot of good stuff. And, of course, he's highlighting all the corruption and fraud in government that they're uncovering, which doesn't surprise me. But I think it's great to bring it out in the open. But he should use that soapbox to, educate people about Republican government and to be proud that America is a republic. We're not a monarchy and we are not a democracy. The Article 4 of the U.S. Constitution says or reads that the United States government shall guarantee to every state of the union a Republican form of government. They didn't say, or they didn't write democratic government. I mean, they knew what democracies were. The founding fathers weren't ignorant. They were a lot smarter than the people in Congress now. They knew what democracies were. That's why they established the American Republic. But just cite the Pledge of Allegiance, right? You'll see that we're pledging allegiance to a republic and not a democracy. And it's not semantics. I mean, there is a big difference between the two. And I'll discuss it a little bit. And I wish that Elon would. And first of all, the fact that we're not a monarchy, thanks to General Washington, who decided to accept presidency. And he also stepped down after his second term, and he started that precedent, which ruled until Franklin Delano Roosevelt stayed on for a third and then fourth term. And that resulted in a constitutional amendment to officially limit the president's term to 2. But George Washington could have had a third term. Nobody would have ran against George Washington. But he stepped down from power because that's the kind of guy that George Washington was. But a monarchy versus a Republican government. A monarchy, you are ruled by a king, a queen, and the title is hereditary. So the king's son becomes the king and is the new ruler. And it's not just the king and the queen. You have a whole nobility, a noble class that rules the common folk, right? You have, barons and lords and dukes, right? And then, if a duke has a kid, he's a duke. If he has a daughter, it's a duchess, right? The titles are also inherited with the land that goes around. So you have the noble class, and then you have all the ordinary people. Well, in a republic, there is no nobility. There are no titles. Everybody's the same. Even the people in government are the same as the people they govern, and they govern by the consent of the people. And that is the difference. It's not about democracy. It's about self-government. We are not ruled by nobility. We are ruled by ourselves, by common folk, because that's all there is. Nobody is above anybody else. Everybody is equal under the law, including the people that are serving in government. Now, in the United States, there are certain elements of democracy. What is a democracy? A democracy is the rule of the majority. And it means that the government does what the majority want to do. You have an election and you do it the majority. Now, you could say, well, there's a direct democracy where you just have an election on every law, right? Hey, if we're thinking of passing a law, let's just put it to a vote and, 50.1% and, we pass it, right? Or you can have a representative democracy, which people think we have a representative democracy, which we don't. A representative democracy would be that the people elect representatives who then vote to do what the majority wants, right? I mean, they're there to represent the majority and to vote the way the majority would want them to vote, right? It makes it simpler to have a representative democracy because you don't have to count the votes of the entire country. You just count the votes of the representatives who, in theory, are there to do what their constituents want them to do. But in America, we have a representative government, but it's not a representative democracy. In fact, when the Constitution was written, the only democratically elected officers in the federal government was the House of Representatives, right? The senators were appointed to 6-year terms by the state legislatures. And the president and the vice president were elected by the Electoral College, which was a completely different group of people. But our elected representatives are not supposed to take a poll and do what the majority of people want them to do. They're supposed to use their own judgment and do what they think is right, even if the majority of the constituents who elected them have the opposite opinion, right? They're supposed to do what they think is right because they're supposed to be smarter. They're supposed to be better informed than the public at large. They're not there to rubber stamp a majority vote. But of course, we have all sorts of checks and balances on the will of the majority. We have a Supreme Court that can strike down unconstitutional laws, no matter how many people support them, right? We have, in order to pass a law, both houses of Congress needed to pass it. And then the president had to sign it. He's just one guy. One guy could veto a bill that the entire majority of both houses wanted to pass. What's democratic about that? It's not democratic at all. And then, of course, if you want to override the presidential veto, you need 2/3. And look at what is required to change the Constitution. You got to get 3/4 of the states to ratify a new amendment. Where's the democracy there?